What I just saw on Piers Morgan's show honestly blew my mind. Like, a debate is spiraling when someone gets asked a simple forward question and immediately starts talking about genitals on live television. Owen Jones is supposed to be one of the top political commentators in the UK, but watching him try to navigate basic biological questions here was just painful. And to make it even crazier, Josh Hammer jumps in later with some brutal legal context that completely blew up the left's whole narrative. Let's look at how this train wreck started.
All right, but I think what we're talking about with Woke One, and let me give you an example. Like, if I was to say to you, what is a woman, what would you now say?
I still believe in what we're going to go down is that I guess the 2020. You want me to talk about genitals on national TV on a YouTube channel? Is that where we're back to talking about genitals? I just think that whole.
I just asked you what. I literally just asked you what a woman is. Simple question.
A woman is a female.
What does that mean?
A female, so a biological female.
It's yes, or someone.
That's important.
Or someone who transitions.
Okay.
Transitions to being a woman.
Also, what? Sorry.
Also, people who transition to being women should be accepted as women, as people who transition to being men should be accepted as men.
Right. So, would you allow trans athletes to play in women's sport?
Yes, but again, with these issues, there was what I think, for example, one suggestion was you can do it by, for example, by weight, or you can do it by testosterone levels. You can
by weight.
Yes. So
surely, Owen. Let me educate you about biology and physiology.
Okay, here we go.
Because clearly it's taken you a few years and you haven't quite got with the programme. When you are a biological male, you have immediately superior body mass, lung capacity, things like that. It makes you stronger and faster and more powerful than biological females. That is why even if you transition, you maintain, as Caitlyn Jenner has talked very openly about,
study shows
you maintained a superior physiology. So my question for you is, by your yardstick then, if you would allow trans women to appear in women's sport, would you then make the Olympics gender neutral? Because it's the same thing. So would you allow the Olympics and, say, the World Cup all to be gender neutral?
There's just, I think on this, firstly, people, again, there's been several studies that show when people transition that actually those advantages go, actually. But I think the other point is...
No, completely untrue. No, Owen,
yes, there
Owen,
are.
I'm sorry, you just lied. Owen, you just lied. You just lied. There is no... Owen, there is zero scientific study that shows if you reduce
where were all these trans athletes taking over women's sports? Where were they? Where were all these great successes? I mean, there was barely any.
Let me explain to you. The United Nations. If I may, the United Nations said that I think in 2024, nearly 1,000 medals at all levels of women's sport were won by trans athletes, thus depriving actual women and girls of winning. Well, it doesn't matter, does it?
Well, it does, because what the argument then would be is that a trans woman would never, ever, ever be able to win any medal.
Owen, your argument, if it makes no difference, would you allow the Olympics to be gender neutral?
No, but again, I mean, with the issue with transport...
Why? Why wouldn't you?
Because we're talking...
Why wouldn't you?
Because we're talking about such a small, tiny number of trans athletes.
No, we're not.
Yes, we are.
No, we're not.
We are. I just never saw this idea that sports were being overrun by trans people.
So just to be clear then, just to be clear, you wouldn't want the Olympics to be gender neutral, even though you believe there is no advantage to being a biological male.
I didn't say there was no advantage. I just said people who transitioned, that those advantages were eroded, and there wasn't actually...
They are not eroded.
There was actually very few examples.
They are not eroded.
There was very few examples of trans women who were thriving at the expense of cis women.
Any doctor or scientist will tell you that reducing testosterone has zero impact on body mass, lung capacity, and the other advantages that being a biological male have over being a biological female.
Well, again, there were two studies. I can't quote them, unfortunately. I was trying to look them up, but unfortunately, this is There's no reception here. There were two studies which looked
by all
at
means,
the
publish your
erosion
studies.
of the biological advantage. But say again, sorry.
No,
But
by all
there
means,
were two
publish
studies which-
your own science about it.
Notice how
What happens when a debate about inclusion collides with biology, competitive fairness, and the limits of political messaging? That is exactly what unfolded on Piers Morgan's show, where a seemingly simple question about what defines a woman quickly turned into a much larger argument over transgender athletes in women's sport. What makes this exchange especially interesting isn't simply who appeared to win the debate. It's the way both sides framed the issue and how quickly the conversation moved from identity and inclusion to physiology, competitive advantage, scientific evidence, and even recent legal developments in the United States. Piers Morgan pressed Owen Jones on whether biological differences matter in sport, while Josh Hammer brought in legal and constitutional arguments that took the discussion in an entirely different direction. So, was this really a debate about inclusion, or about whether fairness in women's sport requires acknowledging biological differences? Let's break down what happened, the strongest arguments from both sides, and where the debate ultimately lands.
What do you mean? Sorry, sorry, we're speaking over each other. Sorry, Piers, say that again.
Well, I think the bottom line, look, let me come to Josh to get involved here. Josh, the bottom line for me is, if you genuinely believe there is no unfair advantage to biological males who transition competing in women's sport, then it follows de facto that you ought to argue that all sports should be gender neutral, because the biology makes no difference. And yet the specific reason we separate the sexes in things like the Olympics and the World Cup and other major events in sport generally is because it is scientifically proven as an undebatable fact that biological males have a physical advantage over biological females.
Yeah, Piers, the only thing that I just learned from this highly unilluminating exchange with my interlocutor and yourself is that my interlocutor is not just intellectually corrupt and incompetent, he's also just mentally and morally incompetent. I mean, there are more problems here than meet the eye. So in the last Olympics in 2024 in Paris, during the boxing tournament, actually, there was a biological female who had, I believe it was a cranial fracture. It was a very severe injury during the Olympic competition from a biological male, which is actually why the IOC has come out and said that they're going to enforce a chromosomal policy, like an actual biological policy, XX or XY chromosome, in advance of the Olympics in 2028 in Los Angeles. I also note here at the U.S. Supreme Court, we just had a case on this. We had a case involving transgender athleticism back towards the end of the term that just ended in June. It was a 9-0 case. It was a 9-0 case that, in this case, Idaho and West Virginia are not discriminating when they ban quote-unquote transgender women, aka biological males, from competing against biological women in athletic competition. That position was supported by the two most liberal justices on the court, Sonia Sotomayor and Ketanji Brown Jackson, the latter of whom, Justice Jackson, infamously, at her own Senate Judiciary Committee confirmation hearing for the court in March 2022, when pressed on this by Marsha Blackburn, Tennessee, infamously refused to say, what is a woman, much like Owen Jones. And yet even she said that it is totally fair to segregate, quote-unquote segregate, I guess, based on biological sex and chromosome structure. So this is an open and shut issue. It's an issue that the left, by the way, has politically been losing on in America quite badly. It's not exactly anyone's probably number one voting issue. It's not the economy or anything, but it's a massive albatross around the neck for the Democratic Party, for the left, which is probably why even AOC herself is taking at least some measures to distance himself from that political toxic.
Yeah, you know, the bottom line, Owen, is that, as I've always said, I want trans people to have exactly the same rights to fairness, equality, and safety that you and I enjoy. I absolutely do. And I really feel for the trans community about how they get exposed to so much mockery by people who promote this farce of trans athletes in women's sport. Last week, I interviewed Martina Navratilova, who was so powerful about this. She said that at the peak of her tennis powers, she wouldn't have beaten the top 500 men in tennis, probably more. I think Serena Williams has said 800, right? There's no comparison between the physiology of these athletes at any level of sport.
I mean, overall,
and when I hear people on the progressive left try and argue this point, most of America and most of Britain think you're completely nuts. Why not just say there is an advantage, it is unfair, I want trans athletes to compete in sport, but not against biological females, because that is as unfair as if they were doping. Because you know, Owen, and I know, and Josh knows, and we should all agree here, that is the reality.
I think the issue that I generally have with this whole so-called quite tawdry conversation debate, which we've had now for several years about trans people and their existence, is it doesn't start from the basis of how do we accept inclusion and work backwards from that. You know, if people who have made these arguments have started from a position of we want trans people to be included, athletics, again, or whatever, whichever topic we have been talking about, because, you know, the vast majority of trans people are not athletes. We're talking about 0.5% of a very, very small minority as is. It's not part of people's everyday experience. If people had started from that basis, then we could have had a rational conversation, but that's not what happened. We had instead a debate led by people who just preferred trans people not to exist. And they wanted to just find...
But I don't.
I know, but
I've been leading this debate.
I'm saying this conversation by the likes of Donald Trump and the people associated with him, when they issue directives...
Well, what about me?
For example, banning
How
trans people from the military and all the rest of it. No, I'm saying, but you're not running the... I'm talking about the United States, the people who've run the superpower of the United States. And the problem is generally...
No, but you're talking to me now.
Trans people is...
When I say to you,
they're frightened to leave
it's unfair.
They're frightened to leave their home. They can't use public toilets. They're scared to use a public toilet. They face physical abuse. They face verbal abuse. They face discrimination in the workplace. And I just think the problem is the whole atmosphere and tenet of this conversation, which is focusing on, which is what happened. This is what reminds me of gay people in the 80s and 90s, because it's always the focus on extreme, basically marginal examples.
But Martina Navratilova is a gay woman.
The whole community as being a problem.
Martina Navratilova is a gay woman.
No, I know that.
This has nothing to do with sexuality.
I know there's various gay, there's some gay people who, I'm not accusing her of this, who actually he spoke about trans people, much like gay people used to be spoken about in the 80s and 90s, which I think is unfortunate. I just think it has to be on the basis of how do we maximise inclusion in society of every possible minority, and for trans people like
it's very simple. It's very simple. Owen,
what is your solution?
Owen, it's very simple. Trans athletes either compete against their biological sex. So if you're a trans woman, you would carry on, as most of them have done, by the way, previously, you would carry on competing against other biological males,
I'm genuinely interested.
Which is your physiology.
Which trans women were competing? Honestly, I'm asking you a genuine question here because I don't know the answer to this.
Which what, sorry?
I'm asking you a question because I don't know the answer to what I'm about to ask you. Which trans women, as trans women, were competing against men? I don't know which athletes you mean.
It's everywhere. It's literally everywhere in the United States.
The swimmer Leah Thomas became one of the most successful swimmers in America.
No, I didn't ask you. That's not the question. That's not the question. That's not the question. It's not the question.
What's the question?
You said that trans women were competing against men, biological men. So I'm asking which trans women athletes were competing against men.
You asked me. You misheard me. They should. In other words, if you want to make trans athletes inclusive...
They said they used to be.
No.
You said they were doing that.
I said almost all of the trans athletes that I've seen reported on used to compete as men against other men. When they transitioned, they then compete against women. The common denominator, Owen, is they are massively more successful as trans women competing against biological females than they ever were. Well, why are you shaking your head?
No, because there've been very few, actually, trans women athletes who have actually, for example, I mean, has any of them won a gold medal at the Olympics? None of them have. Or even a silver medal.
Well, what would you do with... Why do you think you know more than Caitlyn Jenner, who won Olympic gold as a male decathlete?
I don't support
Caitlyn. Now says to anyone who listens that if she was to compete against women, right, biological females, she would destroy them. Why would you know more than her?
It's not, I mean, Caitlyn Jenner. Look, I'm not on the same page as Caitlyn Jenner on a lot of things. She's a pro-Trump Republican. So just generally, obviously, lots of other trans.
So?
But because I don't think she represents the consensus of what trans people would say.
Why do you know more than Martina Navratilova?
I've not claimed to. I'm just saying the very, very few trans athletes who actually do compete full stop. And that this has been, you know, an issue which is affecting, 0.5% of trans people, which has been used to treat trans people as a whole as a problem. Because all we've had to focus on is trans people as predators and trans people as athletes cheating.
Okay, but that argument... Yeah, that argument doesn't work with people like me, though, because I'm somebody who doesn't fit that category.
No, I say that. But
we'll move on.
But I ask you.
You've made it clear. Owen,
no, but you never talk about.
You think it's fair?
Can I ask you?
I think it's unfair.
Can I ask just one thing to you? Because you do actually do a range of, you talk about a range of topics in this programme. I do really appreciate that. But could you not do more on the experiences of trans people who face abuse in the street, who feel scared even to use toilet facilities?
But here's my biggest problem.
If you talk more about those issues...
Owen, let me answer. My biggest problem with so-called trans allies like yourself is that by perpetuating the myth that there is no unfair advantage for trans athletes in women's sport, you are directly amplifying the mockery that then comes trans people's way. And actually, it would help the trans community enormously if people like you said, you know what, I got this wrong. Actually, there is an unfair advantage.
But
how do we make trans athletes inclusive in sport? And here's my answer.
That's not why
they
trans
either
people
compete against their biological... Hang on. They either compete against their biological sex or they compete in a new category. And that is the way to get through this. But as long as you try and tell us that black is white or white is black, and there's no advantage, no chromosomal advantage, then I'm afraid you will continue to be part of the mockery that goes trans people's way. And that's incredibly...
Looking at this exchange as a whole, the most important takeaway is that two different questions were constantly being debated at the same time. One question is about how society should treat transgender people, whether they deserve dignity, safety, equality, and protection from discrimination. On that point, there is a legitimate argument that people should not be reduced to the most controversial examples of their identity. But the second question is much more specific. Does biological sex matter when physical performance and competitive fairness are involved? And that is where this debate became so difficult. Piers's argument was essentially that acknowledging a biological advantage does not automatically mean rejecting transgender people. In fact, he suggested that recognizing the distinction could lead to more practical and honest conversations about inclusion in sport. Owen Jones, meanwhile, focused much more heavily on the broader treatment of transgender people and the danger of allowing a relatively small number of sporting cases to shape public attitudes toward an entire community. Both concerns can exist at the same time. The real challenge is finding a policy that protects transgender people from discrimination while also preserving meaningful fairness in women's competitive sport. And perhaps that is why this debate remains so politically explosive. It isn't simply about identity, it's about where inclusion